Hello and welcome in to Creating the Conditions for Implementation Success in Science. We're going to give a couple people time to kind of join. So we'll just take a couple minutes to just share where you're from, what your name is, maybe what your position at your school is. So please feel free to share that information in the chat. Thank you for joining us today, Jennifer. It's great to have you. Just take about one more minute, but like I said, feel free to share where you're from, what your name is, what your position at your school is in the chat. See Louisiana. Thank you, Callie. Hi, Joy. Charlotte, I bet it's warm there. Oh, looks like we got a great mix of people. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, thank you so much for joining us for creating the conditions for implementation success in science. My name is Ryan. I'm just going to go over a couple quick housekeeping slides, and then we'll pass it over to our presenters. So just a few helpful tips. If you would like to access closed captioning at any time during this presentation, feel free to click the closed captioning button in your Zoom toolbar, and that will enable subtitles and closed captionings for you throughout the presentation. Feel free to participate at any time in the comments. But if you do have a question, we ask you to use the Q&A chat feature, the Q&A feature in Zoom. Leslie and Danielle will hold off on questions until the very end. So if you do have a question, please use the Q&A feature. And you will receive a certificate of attendance from this webinar via Zoom in a day or two. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. So from the UC Berkeley's Lawrence Hall of Science, we have Leslie and Danielle. Leslie is a professional learning specialist for the team that researches and designs science instructional materials for grades K through 8. And she also supports district leaders and educators in districts across the country. Danielle works on the research and design for high quality instructional materials and assessment models. You previously led science assessment efforts at the State Education Agency in DC, and you spent 12 years as a district science supervisor in the Houston Independence School District in Texas. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to Leslie and Danielle.
All right, thank you. I will share my screen. There we go. Well, let's get started. Thank you, Ryan, for that introduction, and welcome to the webinar called Creating the Conditions for Implementation Success in Science. And we are very excited to be here. So this is part 2 of our 2-part series where we explore how district leaders can be science champions. Part 1 was about evaluating and selecting high quality science instructional materials. And if you didn't get a chance to attend or watch the recording, that's not a problem. We'll make sure you have all that information. Today's webinar does build off of that and talks about creating the conditions for implementation success in science. And I also want to point out that this companion guide that you see on my slide goes along with this series, and we'll make sure that you have that link. All right, so a little bit about, you heard a little bit about us as individuals, but I want to say a little bit about where we're from. So we're from the Lawrence Hall of Science, which is part of the University of California at Berkeley. And our group is home to a team of researchers, designers, and educators who've been focused on the development of high quality instructional materials that meet the current standards. And what we've created is a comprehensive K-8 program called Amplify Science. We've had a really wonderful and deep collaboration with our publishing partners at Amplify to bring these materials to schools and classrooms across the country, and to work with educators such as yourselves to support successful implementation. So that's a little bit about where we're from, and but we'd like to know, I know you've been doing some introductions in the chat, but we want to get a sense of who all is here today. And so we're going to do a poll, a Zoom poll that should be coming up shortly. And go ahead and enter what is your role in education. What grade level do you represent, do you work primarily with? And then are you science specific, or do you work with sort of a broad range of content areas? So go ahead and fill in that poll. And when we get most of you answered, we will share the results in just a moment. All right, so if we have most people in, give it a few more moments. We have some results. So it looks like we have a number of different roles, primarily teachers or instructional coaches. Great. And then grade levels, lots of elementary, it looks like, but many people who are working with more than one of the options. And then many people are focused on science, but a number of you are also doing multiple subjects. So nice to know a little bit about all of you, and welcome. We're so glad that you're here. And so even though the title of this series is District Leaders as Science Champions, it'll be a great background for those of you who said you were teachers or teacher leaders, because it'll give you a chance to see what some of the district considerations are in supporting science in your system. So here's our plan for today. First, we'll set the stage by looking at the big picture of what it means to create conditions for implementation success. And then we'll dive into a systems view of instructional reform. We'll talk about 6 key leadership moves that you can take away with you. And as we wrap up, we'll share resources and next steps for your journey. And so we'll have some Q&A time at the end. And as Ryan mentioned, we'll be collecting those questions from you. And you can use that Q&A function, the button for Q&A, for questions we can answer at the end, but also, again, feel free to engage in the chat. Just make sure it's set to go to everyone, not just the hosts and panelists, because then not everyone will see it. All right, so let's set the stage for creating the conditions. To start us off, we're going to think about implementation broadly in terms of putting any new initiative or innovation in place. So we'll start by hearing from you. So take a few moments to recall, think back to a successful school or district initiative that you led, or maybe you participated in. So maybe it was in science or another subject area, or maybe it was something that wasn't academic that was put in place in your schools. When I think about one of the most successful things I was engaged in, it was not related to science. It was actually related to the end of the year in 8th grade, and how we sort of changed up everything for our promotion. But so take a moment to think about what that successful initiative was. And then once you have that example in mind, I'll have you share out about what do you think made this initiative successful? Why was it that it worked? So go ahead and add that to the chat. Again, make sure that it's going to everyone, not just hosts and panelists. So why was that initiative successful? What were some things in place that supported that work? Give a moment for those chats to start coming through. I know I have some ideas in mind for the example that I gave. What was it that made that initiative successful? All right. Successful because teachers saw the value, well supported by school management. Prepare teacher with background and information. Biweekly data PLCs, great. Collaborative nature, lovely. And it took a while for these to come in because lots of details that people are adding. We appreciate that time. So enough time there aligned with the vision and the mission of the district. So you can feel free to keep putting those in, but it definitely feels great to be involved with something that's going well. And when things, I can see this mentioning multiple factors that are lined up, and it feels like it's supporting students. Teacher agency, love that. But now let's think about sort of the other side. And I'm sure you have had experience with initiatives that aren't so successful, that feel more like they're a struggle, or maybe they're even having trouble just launching. So take a moment. And what are some barriers that you might have encountered or seen to implementing initiatives in schools? And again, go ahead and put that in the chat. And we'll just pause for a moment as those come through. Still have a lot of those positives coming through, but what are some barriers that low support, lack of materials, lack of interest? It's interesting how this, as we said, it's sort of like the flip side. Teacher training, funding, absolutely. Too many initiatives or competing priorities, things that are not aligned, lack of that clear vision. Funding and time. And so I would imagine that a number of those resonate with you as something you may have experienced or seen. And so I'm going to pass it over to Danielle to kind of summarize this.
Yeah. Yes, again, my name is Daniel Alcazar-Roman, and thank you so much, Ryan, for the introduction, and thank you for coming and being with us during this presentation. So with these last two exercises, you thought about words or phrases like the ones we have on the screen. So time, mindset, instructional material support, alignment. You've mentioned other great ones. You can think of each one of these as barriers, or we can think about them as conditions or barriers for implementing a new initiative in education. Now we turn our attention to science in particular. This subject area may be very different from ELA or math. In the last 10 years or so, there has been a paradigm shift in science education that was brought on by the development of new science standards. Many states are fully implementing the standards now. Others are rolling out new assessments and accountability measures for these standards. Some states are beginning the adoption processes. But if we set the timelines aside, overall, the standards represent a big departure from how science was being taught and learned in the past. It's a shift to phenomena-based approach. So in a phenomena-based approach, we will see things like you see on the slide, naturally occurring events that take place in the world that we can use what we know of science to explain or predict. Help students be curious and help them ask questions and want to investigate them. And these phenomena are complex, and they require students to dive deeply into learning experiences and to gather evidence and to make some go through some sense making. Yeah, so and this changes really affect what's happening in the classroom. So with the standards in the past, we might have students memorizing facts or definitions or moving from topic to topic, like the water cycle or learning all about penguins. In this approach, students are figuring out science ideas and teachers are facilitators in this journey of learning. This might feel different to teachers, different to students, and look very different for administrators and other members of the community. So one way to address this so that all students and teachers are making these efforts together to shift is to think about high quality instructional materials, or HQIM. HQIM are defined as materials that meet rigorous criteria for being standards-based and easy to use by educators and easy to implement by the systems. But they may come in the form of teacher guides, kits, digital tools, and curriculum. And you can see this quote here from Ed Reports and Next Gen Science that says that one of the most important factors for ensuring that all students experience science education that prepares them for future success is access to high quality standards aligned instructional materials. So we went into a lot of detail about this in our first webinar. So if you want to know more, you can access that recording. All right, so today we're addressing science, teaching, and learning that are based on three-dimensional standards, like the next generation science standards, or state-specific standards that are based on the same framework. So throughout this presentation, we may just say NGSS as shorthand for this type of standards. So it's not just that these new standards are in place and the shifts to teaching and learning are different. There's some unique things to science that may not have that science is not prioritized in schools as other subjects. That's one big barrier. As a recent call of action from the science education from the National Academy of States, science education is not a national priority. It needs to be in elementary schools through higher education. Nationally, there are statistics that show that science gets less time than other subjects. And the amount of time, particularly in the K-5 classrooms, has been decreasing over the last 10 years. And we know that science isn't tested the same way that other subjects are tested. So often the departments have less time, resources, or attention. So when we think about the conditions for success for science in particular, we do need to be able to address new ways of teaching and learning, new ways of prioritizing science with the current educational system. And this is why we talk about having our science champions, the people who have vision and ideas for implementing this new initiative. So in our last webinar, we talked about championing science as a multi-year journey. The various graphics you see on the screen come from organizations that have resources for districts about the processes of choosing and implementing high-quality instructional materials. We're going to share these resources and links to the organizations at the end of the webinar. But for science in particular, because of all these new changes, it's certainly not a linear process from beginning to end. Rather, it's a journey with twists and turns, with challenges and opportunities, and setting up the conditions for successful implementation of high-quality instruction is work that happens along the way. So we'd like to talk to you next about a systems view when you're navigating through this journey, to help you think about the alignment of different factors that come into play when you're championing science. So clearly, beyond just adopting new materials or simply implementing new standards, instructional reform is a complex and it involves a number of factors in the system. As an individual in your particular role, it might be hard to see all the parts of the system. So next, we'll like to introduce you to a research-based view of an instructional reform framework that might help you unpack the factors that are at play in the scenarios of implementing an initiative like the one you mentioned earlier. So we're first going to look at a model from a study of science reform conducted by the Smithsonian Institution in 3 regions of the United States, including large urban schools, suburban schools, and rural schools. The model describes the elements of systemic reform that are necessary to affect sustainable change. All these elements are equally important and must be addressed at the same time over a sustained period of time to ensure that there's long-term success of the program. There are 5 elements that I'm sure will look very familiar to you. So obviously, first we have HQIM. As we mentioned, high-quality instructional materials are defined as materials that meet rigorous criteria for being standards-based and easy to use by educators and systems. Next, we have material support, that this involves designing efficient and cost-effective procurement practices, refurbishment, maintenance, and distribution of materials and technology that are used in the science classroom. Next, we have an assessment system. So HQIM includes embedded classroom assessment, but additionally, a balanced system of assessment may include interim and monitoring assessments. All these are tools that help educators formulate feedback for students and help teachers determine next steps for instruction. And the assessment will help meet reporting and grading requirements and provide data for schools and districts to have a clear picture of how science is going, how what students are learning, and how the students are learning. Professional learning. So in addition to having embedded professional learning in HQIM, a district may want to design a system that also supports teachers to improve their content and pedagogy, as well as provide support and leadership opportunities to develop teachers as teacher leaders. And last, we have administrative and community support. And this refers to things like aligning school, district, as well as community leaders in higher education, business, industry, informal science educators, technical providers, industry leaders, to all work together to sustain this vision of an effective science program. So there's also another set of rules in the system that are also very powerful drivers of behavior, and they're social rules. And these might have positive or negative impacts on educational reform efforts. These areas have been addressed in the research from Hopkins and Spillane and include regulations, norms, and beliefs. And let's talk about these in more concrete terms. So the authors of the paper argue that in addition to thinking about these 5 components in blue, you also have to think about 3 components of social rule systems theory that all institutions exhibit because they're all made of humans. So first of all, we have regulations. So what rules or structures are in place. Then we have norms, or what school and district, they include district norms and school norms that are involved. And third, we have beliefs, or what do people feel and believe in the system. So regulations, they're official rules, policies, and structures like instructional minutes, department meeting structures, materials, distribution systems. Norms are more unofficial, but still very real, they're shared understandings of how we do things around here, and they can be at the district or school level. So for example, one district I know is they have a strong norm about teacher autonomy. That means the idea that teachers decide their own thing within the district. And finally, we have the beliefs that refers to the hearts and minds, what people think and feel. So for example, what's important to teach and what's important for students to learn. So the idea that in addressing the elements of systemic reform in blue, we also have to work with these orange sections that bring those into alignment. Sometimes these work against each other, or the orange will work against the blue sections, and sometimes they work together. So we're sharing this because we think it's a useful framework for thinking about challenges of instructional reform. All right, so let's take a moment to use the systems view to consider implementation of science materials in your context. Now, keep in mind that you've been introduced to this model just right now in a few minutes, and you probably haven't had a lot of time to fully wrap your mind around it. But the value of the systems view, as we mentioned earlier, is that it can help you consider all the parts that are involved. So let's look at the elements in blue first. We would like you to think of how these elements are being addressed in your system, in your implementation of science materials. So for example, you might want to choose an area like professional learning and think about how your system addresses ensuring that teachers are supported through the implementation of coaches or learning academies or just-in-time learning. So take a couple of minutes to think, and if you would go into the chat and share one idea with the rest of us. And make sure you share with everyone, not just the host and panelists. Let's see. Right. So we have Jennifer sharing about administrative and community support, that they have administrative training on curriculum and skills, planning, absorption, coaching, monthly check-ins, quarterly walkthroughs with district administrators. So that's really helpful for that. Joy sharing let's see. So a need for training for teachers. So need for improving professional learning, Autumn. So department coaches work together and they work with observation check-ins and walkthroughs. Very good. So as you continue to write and share, we'd like you to go on to we're going to go to the next area, this area in orange. And we'd like you to, take a moment to use the systems view to consider the implementation again in terms and how they are aligned to the social rules, the regulations, the norms, and the beliefs. So in a successful initiative, how are these aligned with the blue elements of infrastructure? So in your science implementation, are there areas that are aligned or not aligned? So think about those norms, regulations, and beliefs that are supported or are becoming barriers to the vision of science education in your school district. So choose one to put in the chat. So for example, you could think about how teachers feel empowered to teach science, or whether principals think that science instruction is important. And thank you for sharing, and we have really nice feedback coming in the chat. So we have some more ideas about some of the elements of a lot about professional learning, a very important area. Idea of having multidisciplinary instruction. Great. So we have some strengths of the 3 A's of academics, anti-racism, and agency. Yeah, and that's part of the working on the beliefs. Joy is sharing how there's a big emphasis on literacy and math that overshadows other areas. Very well. Thank you so much for your feedback and your comments. We're going to continue referring to these as we go along. So to summarize this section, a system view allows you to step back and look at where there's alignment or misalignment in the system. It also allows you to evaluate where you might need to spend more resources to boost conditions or remove barriers in the system. And now we're going to turn it to Leslie to share.
All right, thanks, Danielle. So let's transition now into how this system view supports the work in creating the conditions for successful implementation of science. So as we've mentioned, the selection and adoption of HQIM, or high quality instructional materials, it's an important part of the process, but the right conditions have to be established across the system in order to support buy-in and effective teaching with these materials. So essentially creating alignment with all those different components of the systems model that Danielle described, especially those orange parts, those social rules of the system. So in this section, we'll talk about 6 leadership moves that you can take to create these conditions. So these 6 leadership moves that you see here on my slide, they are pulled from various advice from leaders in the field, as well as from educators that we work with. And these are, of course, not the only actions you can take, but there's some high-level strategies that bring your system into alignment and help create those conditions for implementation success. And I definitely saw in the chat some of these already mentioned. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on each of them, starting with those people who will help to create the conditions for implementation success in science, that team of science champions. And so the process of setting up the right conditions for implementation success it begins well in advance of when the new materials actually are put into use. And it starts by establishing a team of science champions. So those key allies who really can invigorate the implementation of science in your system using the selected materials. So your first instinct may be to look at your science teachers, and that's a good one. But be sure to also pull people in from all levels of the systems, from teachers to administrators, superintendents, others, and then consider different roles. So for example, district level cross subject leaders, like maybe ELA or math, or board members or parents. And these people can become champions that take on a variety of tasks. So for example, at the beginning of a process, it's critical to have a team formulate a shared vision for what high quality instruction with your adopted materials entails, and also to create an equitable rollout plan. But as Danielle mentioned, implementation is a journey, and who is part of your team and the goals of the team, that is probably going to change over time. And maybe even you pull in another team. Maybe you do focus at some point down the road on pulling in just a team of teacher leaders who will be science champions at their sites. Or maybe you work with a team of site administrators. And then at any point in your implementation journey, you can also consider your school or district system as part of a larger community system. So who are the science champions within your larger community? Science museums? Is it universities, conservation organizations? Who can champion science with you, who can advocate with you, who can also potentially even align what they offer, what they do with the instructional materials that you're bringing in. And then when you're considering your team of science champion, and this brings us to our next leadership move, can you also collaborate with leaders across subject areas? And we mentioned this earlier, but to leverage the ways that science plays a role in advancing broader district goals and initiatives. So district initiatives like literacy development, cross-curricular integration, student engagement, or deeper learning. So one thing that's helpful to this end is that with our standards and in a phenomena-based approach, the expectation is that students engage in doing science in authentic ways, like scientists do. So this includes having them read and write and talk and investigate during science class. So you can look at your materials and find materials that include those explicit connections and overlaps to other subject areas and initiatives. So for example, you can find instructional materials that have students reading scientific texts and consider how you might work with literacy coaches in your district and so you could use those materials to help further literacy development, or you use materials that have routines to support students in making connections to their own experiences, which can help build student engagement across the school. Now, a key leadership move that your team of science champions can develop and carry out is that communication plan. And we know that teaching and learning that's based on current three-dimensional standards like the NGSS, they can be unfamiliar to families, to administrators, to teachers, and to students. So let's take a look at a video from an NGSS classroom, and we'll consider what shifts it's showing that are important to communicate about. So we'll be watching a few very short clips from a single lesson from a second grade unit where they're investigating how seeds get to new places in an environment to grow into new plants. So students are investigating a phenomenon related to a type of tree called the chalta tree, which grows in India. So you'll hear that referenced. And now as we watch, be thinking about how would you describe this kind of teaching and learning to educators? How about to parents? Or how about to administrators? So we'll show a little bit at the start and
know that we've been talking about why the chalta seeds aren't growing in the Bengal Reserve, right? And so now we're on chapter 3. Giselle, can you go read chapter 3, the question on chapter 3?
Why aren't the chalta seeds getting to places where they can grow?
But what?
All right, so later in the lesson, students participate in a classroom model of an ecosystem. And the classroom is set up with different trees around the room where students, in the role of birds, they have to go eat the seeds and bring them back to the group where they get put in their stomach, which is a plastic baggie. So let's take a look at what this looks like. We'll skip ahead a little bit.
So can you eat? Yeah. Finally get to eat. Wow, your bird is really eating. Okay, what round are we on? 5. Okay, roll brain. 5. How's your bird doing? Is your bird eating? Wow. Okay. Okay, well, let's see. Maybe we'll get a 6 or a 2. Oh, 6.
Oops. All right, going back. So once they've collected some data on their recording sheets, students pause the model and they discuss the question, how do seeds get to where they need to grow? And so I'm going to jump ahead so we can see a little snippet of that conversation that they have.
But also, like Julian said, but they're gonna go into the ground and more bushes.
Okay, so you're there.
And I'm
All right, so that student was describing how when seeds get to a new place, they grow into plants. And so at the end of the lesson, and we'll just jump to what that looks like, the teacher brings the class back together to help them make sense of what they did. And they discuss the answer to the question about how animals help seeds get to new places or get dispersed in the habitat. And so let's just take a quick moment. And if you can think about what words or phrases came to mind to describe the teaching and learning that was happening in these little snippets of video of this lesson. So go ahead and add to the chat just words, quick words or phrases that came to mind to describe the kind of teaching and learning that we saw in this video. We'll give it a moment. We saw student-centered, great. Thanks, Erin. Jennifer is hands-on, inquiry, student talk, collaborative, modeling, excellent, Joy, thank you. Contextualizing learning, busy, great. Some great discourse, Beth shared. Yeah, and this is really the intent of the NGSS or of any of the state standards that are three-dimensional and phenomena-based. But of course, this is different from how science has been taught and learned for many decades in US schools. And while these new ways of teaching science are different, keep in mind those social rules, those beliefs, those norms from the systems model. It can be scary and make people nervous to face change. So instead of framing it as something we're throwing away or starting brand new, we can think about framing it more as a positive shift or a build from what we've done in the past. So for example, one shift is around how students formulate science ideas in class. So we might say it's less about using teachers or textbooks as the primary source of science information. Teachers are still important and information from books is still important, but science will involve students engaging and gathering evidence to answer questions through a variety of sources, such as simulations, books, articles, modeling, and investigating. The teacher will be facilitating the evidence gathering and the sense making, but as you saw in the video, the teacher isn't in the mode of telling or being the primary source of information. And another shift is around what you might see when you walk into a classroom, or what you might hear your child say about what they did in science class each day in the past, or in what we maybe would recall from what we did in high school. We would think of students primarily doing experiments or labs for most of that science time. But in this new era, students will be engaging in practices that really reflect what scientists do, because scientists argue. They ask questions, they analyze data, they create those models, they communicate in different modalities with other scientists. And of course, they also do sometimes engage with physical investigation. So take some time to consider how you will communicate these exciting changes that will be taking place with the implementation of your new science materials. Now, communicating the importance and value of NGSS design, teaching, and learning is essential in building enthusiasm for new materials and aligning your system. But as Danielle mentioned, science education is not the priority it needs to be. And I've seen it mentioned in the chat also, and especially in relation to other subject areas. So this brings us to our next leadership move: allocate and protect instructional minutes for science. So the required minutes for science, it varies widely from state to state, region to region, district to district. So it may require special attention to make progress in this area. But when you've put the time and effort and investment into adopting quality science materials that you believe will have a strong positive impact on student learning, it is essential that instructional minutes for science are allocated and protected. And so key to this is really having clear rollout plans, as well as developing pacing guides, and utilize your science champions to ensure that, number one, that they're realistic, and then, but also use your champions to support the messaging around the plans and the pacing guides. And then you can also work with site leaders to adjust pullout and intervention times, which we know oftentimes occur during science. And so try to figure out ways to avoid that happening and avoid disrupting science. And for self-contained classrooms, for self-contained classrooms, such as those in elementary schools, additional work might be needed to determine how to fit science minutes in to each day or week that will allow the expected number of lessons to be taught in a designated time frame. So designating a specific time into the instructional day, as shown in this example here, it's very important, but it's not just about having something down on paper. It will require some creative reprioritizing. So for example, it might involve integrating across subject areas or alternating blocks with other subject areas. And then the support of the elementary site administrator is particularly key in this endeavor of protecting instructional minutes. And so both in terms of the messaging, the expectation that this time should stay protected, but also in supporting teachers and figuring out ways to find efficiencies in teaching across multiple subjects. Just to share an example, one instructional leader that we've worked with gathered schedules from elementary teachers in his district that were making time for science. And then he was able to use those schedules as examples for other teachers and administrators across the district to show these authentic solutions in their same context for how to make time for science. And so in addition to allocating and protecting time for science, teachers need the support to make the shifts called for when utilizing these new materials. And this brings us to our next leadership move, planning for ongoing professional learning for teachers and administrators. So published curriculum materials will often come with a set of professional learning experiences that can help jumpstart the implementation. But supporting ongoing learning over time is also super crucial for implementation success. And this could mean taking a broad view of what professional learning can look like. So for example, you can take advantage of curricular resources such as educative videos and notes. Also consider how your system can provide additional forms of PL, sort of beyond maybe the 2-hour after school or professional learning that happens on a professional development day. Look at one-on-one coaching, grade level team time like PLCs or school-based PL, and virtual learning across schools. We learned so much about virtual and remote learning in our time when we were out of the classrooms. We can take advantage of that as a form of professional learning we can use with teachers at times. So principals also need support in understanding, and I saw this referenced in the chat also, but in understanding those shifts that might be happening in their science classroom. So leading classroom walkthroughs to highlight these shifts, that can be an enlightening professional learning experience for principals. And it's so crucial that principals are in alignment when we consider what Daniel was talking about in that systems view. And then finally, don't forget about your own professional learning. And so this leadership move of your own professional learning is captured in this quote from the report, Administrators Matter in NGSS Implementation. It reminds us that instructional leaders need learning opportunities if they are to adequately understand the substantial shifts of the next generation science standards and support teachers in implementing them. And so one possibility is to seek out the learning opportunities offered by authors and publishers of high quality instructional materials that support the science leadership in your system. So that could look like webinars like this one, or other learning opportunities that are part of the publisher provided resources. And then there are also a number of organizations that offer resources to support learning around adopting, evaluating, and sustaining high quality instructional material implementation. And as we've talked about implementation being a journey, so is the learning around it. They both take place over the course of years. And then because we all know that the implementation of new instructional materials, and in particular with the shifts called for in the NGSS, that implementation requires strong leadership. So consider engaging in professional learning that focuses on how to lead this kind of change, and especially support for taking that systems view of that change. And then regardless of what type of professional learning you engage in, we really strongly suggest you find your own community of practice. Championing science is hard work, and you may find even with your team of champions that you're the only one in your particular role. So collaborating with other job-alike colleagues can invigorate your work and help you seek solutions. And so as we've been saying, the implementation of new materials is a journey, and success depends on alignment in your system around supporting that implementation. Now, these 6 leadership moves, they can help bring your system into alignment and create the conditions for implementation success in science. And so with that, I'm going to hand us back over to Danielle so he can share some resources and next steps.
Thank you. So zooming back out to the championing science theme, it is important to keep in mind that this is a journey. Different organizations, as well as best advice in this area, as pictured in these various graphics, will remind you that seeing a shift to having a more and better science teaching and learning in your schools is a process. It starts by setting a vision for strong science instruction, considering and selecting HQIM, and then working to bring the different components of your systems into alignment in order to create the conditions for implementation success. As I've mentioned, there are a number of resources to support you in this journey. One of these resources is from WestEd. It's called Developing District Plans for NGSS Implementation. It is specific to science, and it really looks at some concrete steps for district teams. And Les is going to put the link of this in the chat. Another resource is a case study published by the Council of Chief State School Officers, CCSSO, that illustrate examples of states who have worked to implement and support HQIM. Another resource is Rivet Education. That's a group that supports districts in adopting, evaluating, and sustaining HQIM across the subject areas. We encourage you to look at their blog series and webinars related to this topic. And finally, Ed Reports, that has some very comprehensive guidelines to help you in this journey. These guidelines primarily focus on HQIM, but they also have advice on implementation topics. And this is their area there. You'll see the link in the chat. And lastly, we'd like to thank you for attending this second part of the series of webinars. And we're going to move to Q&A next with Shannon. And Shannon's going to be putting a link with the implementation guide, so you can take a look, a closer look at what we have been discussing.
I think it's Ryan that's going to take
us. Oh, sorry, Ryan is going to take us.
Yeah. No worries at all. So thank you, Leslie and Danielle. You guys did such a wonderful job. As I'm looking in the Q&A, I do not see any questions, nor were there any in the chat. So it looks like we are actually good to just go ahead and move on, unless there's anybody that has some final questions. Okay, so again, thank you guys so much for attending our webinar. It's always absolutely wonderful to have the Lawrence present with us. You guys just put out such amazing things. And to everybody who participated and joined today, thank you. For more from us, you can explore more ways to champion science with UC Berkeley's Lawrence Hall of Science at amplify.com/PD with LHS. If you want to learn more about Amplify Science, you can go to amplify.com/science. And if you are a current Amplify Science user, please feel free to join our Facebook community. There's always great stuff in there, people dropping resources, people sharing success stories, and you can join that at facebook.com/groups/Amplify Science Community. And lastly, if you're a district level leader using Amplify Science, join the instructional leaders community of practice at bit.ly/LHS-ILCP. And with that, I think we can go ahead and just say thank you guys for joining, and have a great rest of your evening. Bye. Bye.